Got joining us today, we've got Zoe Amar. Many of you will already know Zoe, but for those of you who don't, Zoe runs her own agency, Zoe Amar Digital, and she's also the chair of the Charity Digital Code of Practice. So she's our, I guess, deep expert in this subject. Probably having, I'm trying to remember, how many years now is it since you started working on the Code of Practice, Zoe?
Over 3. It's 4 years now.
Yeah, it must be 4.
Time flies and having fun.
Exactly. So yeah, it's a great body of experience and from before that on digital to share with us. And also joining us, we've got Graham Manuel Jones. Graham, until very recently, was the head of digital at Maggie's. He was at Maggie's for 4 years in total as well. So welcome, Graham. So in terms of today's session, this is the third of 3 sessions. Hopefully you've been able to join our previous ones. If you haven't, it doesn't matter. They do stand alone as well. But our previous ones were focusing on, first of all, looking at where you've got to in terms of your digital, particularly how you've progressed through the COVID pandemic. A pandemic which I'm really hoping we might be through in the not too distant future now. Might not feel like it with Omicron at the moment, but I think we can start planning, which obviously was the subject of our second webinar, which was planning for the post-pandemic world. And then today, the focus really is on how you get the buy-in from your stakeholders. And I know from personal experience, this is an area that a lot of charities find challenges with. And it's not just charities, it's all organizations really. So it's a really super important topic to explore. So in terms of today, as I've already said, we're aiming for it to be nice and interactive through the chat function. There'll be plenty of opportunities for questions, both as we go along and also at the end. The session is being recorded as well for those people who aren't able to join us live today. And also if you want to go back and refer to it after the event as well. In terms of the, if you want to raise questions, use the chat. Those, depending on your machine, if you're on a PC, then those are the buttons at the bottom. If you're on the apps, they're in different positions as well. So I don't want to take any more time now. I'm keen for Zoe and Graham to be able to get into the content. So I shall hand to Zoe to kick us off.
Thanks so much, Jonathan. And it's brilliant to be here today to talk about one of my favourite topics, a topic which clearly brings some challenges with it, because obviously none of us can really move forward with digital without getting our key stakeholders behind what we're doing. So we're really pleased to be digging into this topic today and finding out a bit about where you're at with it and whether perhaps some of those behaviours and attitudes that you're seeing from senior stakeholders may have changed during the pandemic, whether that's for better or worse. So we are going to be talking now about what we are going to be covering today. So there are 3 key things. Firstly, we're going to do a bit of problem definition. So we're going to be trying to identify some common challenges in stakeholder engagement. Then Graham is very kindly going to take us through some influencing techniques that have worked for him in the various charities that he's worked in. And he's got some fantastic experience to draw on there. So I'm looking forward to hearing more about that. As part of this, we'll have a bit of a think about where you're going to be influencing senior stakeholders, but perhaps where you may also be looking at influencing your peers as well. So you might be a head of who needs to influence another head of in your organisation. So I'd like to think about senior perhaps quite broadly in that way. And then we'll have some time at the end to go through some questions. I'm sure lots of you will have things that you want to ask Graham. There may be broader questions that you have as well about engaging stakeholders. So we're very happy to chat through all of that as we go through today. So first of all, just to very briefly talk about the Digital Code of Practice, because I know not everyone has heard of it. It's a framework to help charities understand where they're at in digital in comparison to best practice, and then to identify where there may be some areas for improvement. The aim is to ultimately make the sector more sustainable in how it grapples with digital, to use digital to increase its impact and also to grow capacity and skills. And it's used by cite a number of different charities, so whether that's NSPCC, whether that's Click Sargent, and some of the other great organisations you can see here, is just worth briefly saying at this point, it's for small organisations as well as large ones there. So whatever size you are, hopefully there's something in there that's useful for you. On the next slide, there are just a few ground rules for today. I'm conscious that stakeholder management, and I'm very aware of this with the work that I do, and also having worked for 5 years in a charity previous to setting up my consultancy, this can be quite a tricky topic. So we are going to be talking about potentially some slightly sensitive issues. Really important to everyone here today. I'm sure that it's a safe space for you all. So we'd just like to keep it really respectful and really positive. And also we think it's best not to mention key stakeholders by name, just so that people can speak as freely as possible. Great, so we want to start with a bit of an icebreaker. So to take the temperature of where you're all at with internal stakeholder engagement with digital. So thinking about some of those key stakeholders you need to influence in this area at the moment, who do you need to convince and what do you need them to do? So we'll give you a moment to have a think about that. And then if you could pop your answers in the chat, that would be great. Off you go. Some great answers coming in already. Thank you. Oh, and trustees is coming up quite a lot. Really interesting. And of course, investment very much aligned with that. And a great point there from Rob about a CEO who's kind of saying the right things, but you're not sure you've really fully got hearts and minds there. Yeah, so that's a really interesting one, perhaps to think about why that is. And actually, I do think that is a really interesting situation, because I always feel in terms of stakeholders, sometimes it's easier in some ways to deal with either the champions or the blockers, because you've got a definite idea of their position. But where someone is perhaps slightly indifferent, I think it's really helpful to perhaps dig into that and find out a bit more about that. Actually, we've got an exercise on the next slide that will hopefully help with that. Okay, great. So fantastic range of different stakeholders there. And it's really interesting to see, perhaps not surprising, to see trustees coming up a lot, and also investment as well. And I think there's something here around where we can guide the senior stakeholders that we work with in terms of priorities, which feels like a bit of an emerging theme as well. So let's move on to the next slide. And what we'd like to do here is begin to unpack this challenge a bit more. So what we've done in the first couple of exercises of this session is to effectively take some digital techniques, but to apply them to stakeholder situations. And the reason why we're doing this one first to kick off with is that I think when you're dealing with a group of perhaps particularly challenging stakeholders, I know from my own experience that it can feel really overwhelming and perhaps quite difficult. And then trying to break it down into these individual elements can be a really good way to begin to define the problem. So firstly, getting a sense of which stakeholders are involved and what we know about their current priorities. So perhaps if you're getting short shrift from trustees at the moment about investment. What's going on there? Is it to do with money just being tight generally? Is it to do with them not understanding what's critical to invest in digital? I think just beginning to think more about what those underlying motivations can be quite a good way in. Understanding what the challenge is. So is this about a new project? Is this about perhaps people thinking, oh, these things are going to be especially challenging? They're worried about how they're going to manage that time in this. So thinking about what is the nature of these pain points ahead, whether they're real or whether they're assumed. And what I think can also be quite useful is to consider where is this tension flaring up a bit. So it might be in meetings, it might be perhaps in direct messaging, wherever it is, to think about where's this really manifesting itself, so you can begin to think about what can I do to influence these situations. And then finally, bringing this back to why is this a problem really worth solving? If we can make progress on this, if we can bring the stakeholder around, what is it going to help us do? So it might be about working together with your director of fundraising to grow a digital fundraising stream, for example. So 4 quite meaty questions there. I'm going to give you a couple of minutes to have a think about that. And then if you can put your answers in the chat, that would be brilliant. So off you go. Some great examples coming in. I'll just give it 1 more minute and then we will have a look at some of these. Wow, some fantastic examples there. Thank you so much for those. And just picking out some key themes. There are a few points here about digital skills on trustee boards, and I think someone mentioned looking at measuring, in fact, the digital skills of their current board and looking at how they can close some of those gaps in terms of recruitment, which I think is a really sensible, really good way to go. There's a bit of a theme coming through here as well, which I think is really interesting, about the pace of change as well. And I think what's achievable at a time when a lot of staff are probably going to be quite tired and perhaps quite burnt out as well. So, for example, I think someone mentioned, scrolling up the thread here, Laura, you've put in a really good point about there being a full shift, so better incorporating digital tools and services into your workflow. I wonder whether that might have a greater chance of success if you just chunk that down and take it quite gradually. One approach that I've seen work really well in terms of influencing stakeholders where you need to make a significant change like that is to just gradually take that piece by piece and then replay the success, as well as some of the things that perhaps aren't working so well but will be improved on the next iteration back to the wider staff team, because it may be that they just need to gain a bit of confidence in these new processes and to see that it's manageable. So that might potentially be one way to deal with that. Yeah, and some really great examples here, I think, around so it's bringing boards with you, but also I think Laura Elliott has made a really good point here about how can we encourage staff to give their due attention to digital, given that everyone's really busy as well, and how they can be active participants rather than perhaps passive at a time of greater change. So again, I feel like there's perhaps something there about not slowing the pace necessarily, but perhaps chunking up the change a little bit more and making it a bit more manageable for people, and perhaps breaking down those stakeholders group by group so that you can take one group with you and then look at bringing other groups with you as well, so you can gradually build that critical mass of people who are a little bit more engaged. So some great issues coming up here. Thank you very much for those. Jonathan, is there anything which jumps out at you?
Yeah, I think I kind of echo what you just picked out, really. There's definitely a real sense that carrying staff and volunteers as well is a challenge, and getting their buy-in. So I guess on the one hand, there's that kind of the senior governance buy-in of the trustees, which is a fairly common issue, but at the same time, it's no good just having them buying into it if the people who are going to live the change on a day-to-day basis are resistant to it and not embracing what's required.
Yes, I think that's a really good point. And one thing that I have seen in some organisations is where you can start to get different subcultures developing in different parts of the charity. And I think it's particularly for larger organisations where you may get part of the organisation who's a bit more digitally mature and works a bit more of an agile way, and then you may have a trustee board that's perhaps a bit more conservative. Now, I think having slightly different cultures in different parts of the organisation isn't necessarily a problem in itself, provided there's enough to unify everyone and everyone's got a clear sense of where things are actually going. So that's just a potential risk ahead to anticipate in terms of bringing as many stakeholders as you can with you as well. And just final point on that before we move on to the next exercise, Janie made a really good point here about people understanding their own existing knowledge and how that can play a role in the next round of changes you need to make with digital. I think that's such a good point. What I see time and again in organisations is that sometimes people may have some quite good digital skills outside of work, but they don't realise that, or perhaps they don't have the permission to exercise them in their roles. So that's where I think doing a bit of measurement of that, whether it's through a digital skills survey or even doing some one-to-one interviews with key staff, can be quite useful for beginning to pull out the data and the use cases on that and getting a sense of where people may have some untapped knowledge that they can apply in a work situation. Great, some really rich examples there. Thank you so much, everyone. So we've got one more exercise for you before we hand to Graham. What we want to do, having surfaced some of those challenges and begun to identify them, we want to think a bit about, well, where could you potentially go from here? And those of you who have come to sessions I've been involved in before will know that I'm a big fan of how might we questions. So beginning to think about, now we've identified what the issue is, let's have a think about what we could then do to move this forward. Now, you may not necessarily have an idea of the solution at this stage, and the idea of this exercise is that the answers you come up with aren't too broad, aren't too narrow, don't necessarily box you into anything at this point, but it's really about opening the door and beginning to think about, well, where could we go with this? Even this sounds really difficult. What could we begin to do here to begin to make some steps forward in this area? So thinking about those challenges, let's consider how might you begin to potentially improve things within those challenges that you've mentioned. Again, we'll give you a couple of minutes, and then if you could pop your answers in the chat, then we will see where you're at. So off you go. That's a great answer, Kim. I love that. I think the more you can tap into the shared language that your organisation has, and it doesn't even necessarily need to be about digital, that's really great. So I love those points that you've identified there. Thank you. Oh, sorry, Heidi, not Kim. Thank you, Heidi. I'll just give that one more minute and then we'll see where you're at. Yes, some great responses coming in. Thank you so much. So I'll just start to go through these. I'm sure we'll get a few more. David, I really like your point about reframing here. I don't think this is necessarily too broad at all at this stage. I think this relates to, I don't know whether it's you or someone else who made the point about, in fact, I think it's Rob actually who made the point about whether the CEO is really emotionally invested in digital or not. But I think these two comments are very much aligned. And one thing I would look at here is where your leadership team have previously made the jump to care about certain things, where perhaps in the past they've been, you know, they've not been so sure about something, but then actually they've realized that it's important for one reason or another. So there's a phrase that psychologists often use, which I come back to again and again in our work, which is nothing predicts behavior like behavior. So have a think about where the leadership team previously, where they've gone from perhaps being a bit indifferent about something to, oh, actually, this is why this matters. And then think about how you can make the case for digital in that context. So I think that's a great question that you've asked there, David. Thank you. Super. So let's take a few more of these. There's tons here, which is super. Laura, I like your point here about how digital can help alleviate staff workloads. I know that's obviously a really big issue for a lot of organisations at the moment, and they're really worried about well-being and burnout. So I think that's a great way to look at how you can frame that in that context. Sounds really sensible to me. Oh, and Jane, I love this point about the ultimate goals as well. I think one area that's perhaps slightly overlooked when it comes to strategy, but also where we influence stakeholders, is where we can keep bringing things back to, what is our North Star and what are we going to do, and also what we're not going to do as well. And I think that really makes it easier to start making decisions, but also to look at what you're going to say no to as well, which I do think is a bit of a challenge as we reach this stage of digital adoption where people are using more tools and more platforms as well. So that's great. I think that's really, really good. And I like the thing you've outlined there, Jane, about where you can begin to kind of cascade and scale this approach as well. So that sounds very sensible to me. And then, and Rob, I love your point about how might we encourage staff to share the challenges they face without losing face. I think this is a particular issue for senior stakeholders, actually, where they may have spent 20 years becoming a policy expert or a finance expert, but then really, in order to progress with digital, we all need to be able to own that journey of, I feel comfortable with this, I'm not so sure about this. So encouraging people to open up about where they may be finding things challenging, I think is a really important one. And there was an organisation I was working with recently where the CEO was actually able to be really open about that and to say, look, I know a lot about this, but actually this area I really don't know that much about. We're going to spend some time with these staff who know much more and can teach me. So if you can find some key senior people who are willing to do that, then I think that will make people much more open about sharing their vulnerabilities in that area as well, which will be really encouraging for other staff. Fantastic, great, some really good points there. Thank you so much, everyone. Jonathan, anything from you?
So I think, I think it's Heidi again picked out the importance of making it relevant to the sector. And I think that's a nice general theme, actually. The more relevant you can make your communications, your messaging, the question you might frame in this case to the audience you're talking about, the more beneficial it will be overall.
Definitely. Yeah, really good point. Thank you. Super. So before we hear from Graham, there was a resource that I just wanted to very briefly share with everyone, if I could have that. Thank you very much. So to think about where your key stakeholders are on this framework. So this is something that you might have seen before. It's an L&D resource which is out there, I think, quite widely, where you can begin to get an idea of kind of personality types, really. So really red is kind of your classic kind of leader. They'll obviously be described in all kinds of forms, and then people who are in the blue and green categories tend to be perhaps a bit more in the introvert category, which I really relate to, being an introvert myself. What can just be quite helpful is to think about roughly, if you've got certain key stakeholders you really need to, but where they might be on this chart, and then also how they respond when they face conflict. So I was talking to someone earlier in an organisation where they are in one part of this framework, but actually if they face conflict, they end up in another. So it can be useful to think about yourself, where you'll be on this, but also where some of these key senior stakeholders might be as well. And again, I think this comes back to really defining where people are at so that you can then develop some techniques to influence them. Lovely. Right, well, that's enough from me. We've now going to hear some fantastic examples and ideas and some tips for influencing key stakeholders from Graham. So over to you, Graham.
Hi. Yeah, I've just got 4 kind of broad tips really from my experience of things that have helped with trying to influence, mainly senior stakeholders, but honestly really at all levels. So tip number 1 is to really try and get to know your stakeholders and try and think what their needs are too. So it's obviously ideal if you can have one-to-one time with them. That in some ways that answers there's another way of answering the question that Rob had around sort of people's fear of losing face. If you can have that initial conversation with them, they'll probably feel they can speak openly and they don't need to feel so embarrassed or they might sort of admit to you as more of a digital expert that there's certain things they're not sure about, or that they're concerned about. So if you can't do that directly one-to-one, then a good tip from my colleague Mel, who I think is in the audience for the webinar today, is also sending a short questionnaire ahead of time. So before you do any kind of group work of any kind, send a short questionnaire ahead of time so you can get their very sort of individual personal thoughts and feedback. And then that sort of saves people being too influenced or too sort of fearful if they're in a group setting and they don't necessarily want to pipe up with their ideas, or if they feel they might be more influenced by the people's opinions. And it also helps you to sort of reframe things on an individual basis as well. So when you're doing that reframing, you can really make it quite bespoke for each person that you're talking to. Another way I think to help you understand how senior stakeholders tick that I found was really helpful was getting a mentor who was at director level. So there's a few schemes that exist for that, and you could try charity comms, for example, and that really gave me insight into what I could be doing that would be really appreciated by my own director at the time, and sort of how to package what you're coming to them with, and how to make the best use of probably what is often quite limited contact if you haven't always got a lot of time with people at that level. And also to get that perspective, you can follow some really interesting thinkers and writers. So a lot of those people have got podcasts. So Zoe co-presents Starts at the Top, and then there's the Charity Digital podcast, Charity Chat, Charity Comms have done podcasts, and then some thinkers and writers like Adam Grant, Bruce Daisley often kind of interview senior people in tech and across sectors actually. And then I'm quite a fan of reading books. So Adam Grant wrote a really good book called Give and Take, which is sort of about how sort of if you actually have more of a giving approach, then there's that reciprocity that people will tend to sort of give back to you as well. And other authors who've written about sort of listening and negotiation and sort of soft skills like that include Chris Voss, Tal Raz, Katie Columbus, Vanessa Bones, Trenton Moss, Konsu Chu-Lok. All sorts of people have written about how to kind of listen and negotiate and influence. So there's probably lots of other good books as well, and I'm happy to share those sort of the authors and the titles. My second tip is just to remember that stakeholders can be at all levels. So sometimes the best way to influence is kind of from the ground up. It's really great, obviously, if digital generally and digital transformation are taken seriously enough to have senior roles to represent them in the organization, but actually there's a huge value in learning from people at all levels of the organization. So some of the best influencers are people who've really kind of walked the walk and been in a similar position to the people they're trying to influence. So it can really help if you've got experience of some of the sort of the fears and the challenges that people have had, and also reassure them from your own experience. You know, not that you're kind of swooping in from a senior position with a limited understanding, just trying to change things in quite a sort of blunt way. You're actually peers and you've been there yourself, and you can try and potentially enlist other champions at all levels to help you with that influencing. My third tip is make sure all of the project team and the people who are involved in getting the work done are on the same page and consistent, and actually especially extend that to any kind of external suppliers and partners that you're working with. Because if you agree more of a unified approach, I'd say that definitely applies just as much as external as internal colleagues. So with Heidi's point about sort of about language and using the right language, I actually once got a supplier to present a product to my director and some of the team, and kind of out of nowhere they just started using loads of business jargon and sort of just terms that were just really at odds with our kind of tone of voice, and it really put up my director off, especially because she was in charge of the charity's tone of voice and trying to go for a really sort of jargon-free human tone of voice. So top tip would be make sure you run through presentations and reports and things like that with suppliers or people who are sort of outside your organization before they present that to stakeholders, just to make sure that you're all in sync and you're using the right language, You've got the right focus as well, so that you're definitely focusing on the things that you know that stakeholder is going to be most interested in and concerned about, and also just so that it actually resonates with what your stakeholder needs, and you're kind of not wasting their time. And then my fourth and final tip is just that influencing isn't always just one moment. It can actually be quite a long game. So although it often is, sometimes it's not that one moment, or just like a chance to influence at a meeting or in a presentation or through a report or a paper or a strategy. Some of it is about the conversations that you have along the way, and also just the way that in an ongoing way you present yourself and your ideas and the way you build relationships. So I think it's also really important to back it up with the right processes and documentation. So an example of that is I've had directors, especially directors of finance, who were never as interested in kind of the visionary part of it and the kind of the ideas side of things, but they are impressed if you get the basics right. So make sure that your kind of ongoing reporting and any forecasting and things that's expected of you, your budgeting, is correct and clear and really well set out with good commentary, because then that should reassure them that you're on track and that you can be trusted and relied on. And I've also found in turn that can help them if they need to influence others as well. So like maybe their fellow directors or trustees, finance committees, different and actually external funders is a really good one, because if your sort of documentation is really clear and complete, then I have had experience where directors have been able to use that to secure funding without having to kind of have a lot of toing and froing as part of the application process, because the information is clear enough up front. And a final point would just be, it's really good to have a kind of visible record, like a backlog or a pipeline of projects and items of work that are coming up. And that just helps your stakeholders to see that their project is still on the list, and it's clear that it's been prioritized and it is planned for in the future, and that there are those kind of review points, maybe monthly or quarterly, where they're being discussed and reprioritized, but they know it hasn't been forgotten about. So that's my 4 main tips.
Amazing. Thanks so much, Graham. Really helpful. And there's some nice comment there from Heidi in the chat actually about change management as well. So thanks so much for that. Really helpful. If you would like to ask Graham or me any questions, please do put them in the Q&A and we will happily discuss them.
Good. So I'm going to step in and chair the Q&A whilst we're waiting for people to put their thoughts down, their questions down. In the chat earlier on, there was an interesting point here from David. So I thought I might give this to Graham and Zoe now as a first question. He was talking about how to persuade the trustees to care, and that in a corporate context, executives receive objectives that often define their remuneration, but in the charity he supports, there's nothing like that. So how to actually come, I'm broadening out this question a bit because he was saying maybe it's the constitution, but if we ask the question more generally, how to maybe get that drive that you might have in a corporate environment around objectives into a charity environment.
I could sort of chip in and I think that maybe sometimes it's sort of about trying to give examples that are from their peer group. So perhaps showing what other charities have achieved, and or sometimes taking examples from maybe their sector. Like often, if I've had experience where trustees are often not from a charity sector background, they're maybe from quite senior levels of different industries, and actually, if you can give an example of a comparable thing that's happened in their sector, like if you the classic example of sort of Netflix sort of destroying the business model of things like Blockbuster, like those sorts of things where there's a kind of comparable example that you can give that's more relatable for them. I suppose that's been helpful in the past.
You got anything to add, Zoe?
Yeah, I was so intrigued by David's point there, because without knowing more about it, I wonder whether there's something about the culture on the trustee board, whether there's perhaps a bit of inertia. And I think that really relates to Graham's point about how do we create that burning platform there. So I completely support what you said there, Graham, about perhaps creating that sense of urgency around, actually, look, similar health charities to us, they're doing this and they're moving forward in this area. Why aren't we doing something like that? So definitely, I think creating a bit of healthy competition with peer organisations is a really good idea. And I wonder whether there's a way to perhaps break off these stakeholders one by one. So if you have a good relationship with your chair, and perhaps going to them about this and saying, look, I've noticed whenever we discuss digital at the board meeting that trustees aren't engaging as much. What's going there? What can I do to support helping them understand more about what we do in that area? Because I think if you can get the chair on side, then they're obviously going to be quite influential in driving the agenda and hopefully bringing some of those other trustees with them. So I'd start with that. I think burning platform and then talking to the chair as well and seeing if that helps move things forward.
I mean, I'd add to that as well. And I'd say that, in my opinion, charities actually should have quantifiable objectives that they set out that actually measure the impact they're looking to achieve. So many of you on this call might have heard of the theory of change. That's quite a sophisticated model for developing those types of impact objectives, but there are simpler ways of doing that as well if you don't want to kind of engage in a more involved process of developing those. So I'd really encourage everybody to have those for their charities. Now I'm going to go, we've got an anonymous question here. It's a nice one, actually goes back to your psychology model, Zoe. So the question is, what is the best way to approach someone if I would consider myself as a green, but they would be a blue on the psychology scale? I don't know if it's helpful to quickly flip back to the slide for this one as well, if we can do that, Mimi. There we go.
Thanks very much, Mimi. Yeah, and a great point, Jonathan, and also thank you to the anonymous person who raised that. I think this is a really interesting one. I do just want to clarify, this isn't my framework. This is something that I've seen floating around for several years, which is obviously really helpful in trying to peg where different stakeholders are at. So how can you influence people if you're green, so more of a perhaps team person and a people person, and then you're trying to influence someone who's blue? Now I'm going to give you an example of where I've had to influence someone who was perhaps more in the blue category. So in the role that I was in for 5 years in-house at a charity, I worked for, at one point I'm reporting to the finance director, who was very, very much in this kind of blue part of the graphic. So very sort of analytical, very sort of perfectionist, asked a lot of questions whenever I went in there to make the case for investment. So I think that's the starting point for you. I think that when you are trying to bring a stakeholder like that on side, you need to be all over the detail, you need to be all over the numbers, you need to be all over the process, and really to start with that, and perhaps to anticipate any key questions that person might have, firstly because then that will provide satisfaction and reassurance to them, but also because if you are a green, then clearly you're someone who doesn't like conflict. I'm not a particular fan of conflict, if I'm really honest about that. So I find that if I'm going to a potentially difficult meeting, the more I can anticipate some of the objections and challenges people make, that kind of makes it feel a lot less personal and means that I feel more confident and comfortable in that situation. So I would start with that, actually. I'd look at the detail and the process and making sure you're all over that and anticipating some of those key questions as well. And then just a final point, and again, I'm relating this largely to one person who was very much in the category, but it's also something I've observed about others who perhaps would be blue as well, is that with the finance director I used to work with, it didn't work well if I tried to spring anything on them. So if I went in there on a Monday morning and said, actually, you know, we really need £10,000 in order to do this, that never worked as well as gradually kind of making the business case for that and then going in there with the ask. So they didn't really like to be put under a lot of pressure to make decisions. Other people who are in the blue category may do, who knows? But I think that just says something about this slow and steady stakeholder influencing approach, which can work really successfully with people who are in that analytical category.
Great, thanks, Zoe. So yeah, we've got time for any more questions. If you want to put a question in, please use the Q&A button. That way we can clearly spot them. Having said that, I have spotted a point in the chat as well, which I think would be interesting for us to discuss. So this is saying, would it be fair to say there aren't a lot of examples of internal digital transformation within charities? So there's lots around changing fundraising to be more digital, lots about pivoting products. So Rob is interested if you have, either of you, Graham or Zoe, examples of how processes and ways of working have been internally improved or transformed.
Yeah, I think I've probably had that at both of the main charities I've worked at, but thinking about somewhere like Diabetes UK, where I was at for quite a long time, the best way of doing that transformation was kind of through just doing it. Like, I think actually then the influencing happens because you're kind of leading by example, and you're not putting it kind of on a pedestal as a thing that is being done in terms of transformation, but actually you are just working on a project that is transformational, maybe starting to sort of take on some of the principles that we've been talking about, and getting, you know, maybe more staff engagement that way, getting them involved throughout the whole process, getting them to help set, you know, what some of the requirements are for a project, and keeping them kind of involved through internal comms and updates, getting them involved in any testing of products and things that you're doing, that kind of thing, that actually at the end, perhaps the product you come out with is the first example of transformation, but you haven't had to sort of label it as transformation while you're doing it. So I think I've definitely seen that in terms of sort of processes and ways of working, but it seems to help if you don't turn it into a really big thing that's kind of people feel is being done to them, that they're just sort of part of that journey that you're taking them on.
Anything to add, Zoe?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. Absolutely. I have seen some great examples of charities making that kind of internal digital transformation. I think the reason it doesn't get talked about is that it's not seen as that exciting, although actually it can be really transformational for the way people work and actually their satisfaction with their jobs as well. If there's anything specific that you're thinking of, I know that Jane's very kindly offered to share some examples from small local charities, but if you're thinking of a specific kind of process or tool, Rob, feel free to drop me an email and I can talk to people in my network and see if I can connect you with anyone who's been on a similar path.
Thanks, Zoe. We've had another anonymous question. This is saying, we've bought into digital as an organisation, but when we've asked for a digital representative on the board, it's been declined. How would you suggest we approach this? Start with you on this, Zoe.
This is so interesting. I'm really intrigued as to why this is. Is there a practical reason? Is it to do with you've got a kind of constitution where they're on there isn't a space on the board for someone, and I suppose that's giving the board benefit of the doubt there, or is it because they're genuinely blocking this because they don't think digital is that important? I don't know whether there are any members of the board, you know, where you could perhaps pick people off for a one-to-one chat and try and find out a bit more about that. But yeah, that's really intriguing. I don't have a magic bullet for that, unfortunately, but it will be good to find out if that's to do with, is a practical question just to do with governance space, or is that to do with genuinely the board not seeing it as a real strategic priority?
Yeah, it'd be good to understand more behind that, actually, because there is a line of thought which says you don't want digital to be owned by one trustee, and that actually the best model is that there's a kind of a collective ownership for it. But if that becomes collective abdication, that's a problem. But if it's collective ownership, where lots of people are active and engaged in it, that is obviously actually stronger than one person doing it. So it'd be good to understand whether it's more obstructive or whether actually they're going, no, we don't think this should be one person doing it. We want to own it more generally.
We never quite got it off the ground at Maggie's because we were talking about it just before the pandemic. But one of the things we were going to look at was, even if we couldn't necessarily get somebody on the board as a trustee to sort of represent digital, or somebody with a lot of experience in digital, was to set up more of a kind of working group that had that seniority and could play a sort of a bit of a consultative role. So it wasn't quite at the level of being a trustee, but that they would be kind of senior enough and respected enough, with some outside involvement and some internal, to try to sort of, I guess, you know, it would have helped me with my digital strategy that I was setting at that time, and that kind of thing, all of those kinds of things, to kind of just give it a bit more sort of gravitas and endorsement from peers of trustees, even if you can't necessarily get them onto the board. And potentially, I guess, if you're working with consultants and things, it may be that there's the potential for one of them to take on a board role as well. But yeah.
That's interesting. The question has actually come back and said it was because none of the existing trustees wanted to take the lead. So it does sound like at that point they should have looked externally to recruit someone, either, as you suggest, Graham, as an advisor, not even necessarily as a full board member, but as an advisor, or someone who did want to become a trustee who had those skills. Sorry, go on.
Yeah, sorry, and just to add to that, so thanks for that additional information. I think that's really helpful. So I wonder there whether there's a skills and confidence issue. So is it to do with, did everyone step back from that because they didn't feel that they had the skills to do that? Again, I guess I'm giving people the benefit of the doubt there, but that may be something to offer the board to say, look, we noticed this. Would it be helpful to help grow your skills and understanding in this area? Another approach that I've seen as well as formal training is if you can perhaps bring in a trustee from another organisation where they're a bit further ahead with digital and how they've crossed some of the bridges that your charity has had to. That might be quite a good way to do some peer learning potentially as well. So you could look at that.
Good. And I'm just going to ask one final question before I ask you to conclude, Zoe. And it kind of goes back to the theme that I felt was coming out a little bit at the start, when we were asking people kind of what the existing challenges were, this kind of challenge of staff who maybe feel overstretched, burnt out, how you get their buy-in. What's your top tips for getting their buy-in to actually having to give some time to actually then enable the organisation to become more digital?
Yes, absolutely. I think this is a real crossroads for a lot of organisations, because the pandemic, I think, has whetted the appetite of a lot of charities for digital, but slightly frustratingly, I think we all need to accept that people are quite tired at this stage. We've had 2 years of this now, and actually, if you go really gung-ho with a massive new change programme at this stage, it may fail. So I would look at perhaps dialing down the pace slightly if you feel that staff are quite tired, perhaps rather than doing 4 big projects this year, maybe just doing 2 or even 1. And also, I think just taking the time to really validate those staff concerns around well-being. I mean, that should really be your number one thing. If staff are really tired, as many people are at the moment, the number one thing is, how can you support them? How can you signpost them to help? And then to try and build the change program really manageably around that, because I think it's so important that staff have that validation of, yes, it's been really tough, here are things that can support you, and we've listened to you, and because of this we're going to really manage this in this way, and we're going to keep checking with you at all these key points so we can make sure that this all develops in a way that's manageable for you.
Brilliant. Thanks, Zoe. Graham, anything to add to that?
Yeah, I guess just maybe, you know, there were a lot of silver linings that came out of the last 2 years, I think, from a digital point of view. And it's sort of, if you've got the opportunity to sort of just remind people of those and celebrate those and say, you know, I totally understand that there's a lot of fatigue there and people are just a bit sick of screens and a bit sick of kind of living their lives digitally. But actually, to sort of not forget that there were lots of positives that came out of that experience, and to sort of celebrate those and remind yourself that actually you did get some benefit from all of that kind of tiring, horrible kind of stuff that happened. So yeah, it's going to be difficult depending on how many successes you felt you've had in that period, but yeah, that could be a way of doing it, definitely. And also, although it's a bit dry, like maybe just formalizing some of this a little bit more, so people feel that they're supported and that they are being listened to. You know, to make sure that if people are expected to do more digital stuff as part of their roles, that is actually reflected in their objectives and their, you know, their job description, and that they're kind of getting recognized and rewarded for it and supported if they need training or they need any other kind of support for their well-being or anything else. That it is sort of being talked about, and it's there, and it's reflected in a more formal way.
Thanks, Graham. Now that's all the time we've got for questions. Going to hand to Zoe, who's got a couple of concluding slides now.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Jonathan. Thanks, Graham. So just in the final few minutes, we would love to hear how you might like the code to support you over the next year. So if you've got any thoughts on that, please do put them in the chat. We would love to hear about that. And then we do have some additional resources to share with you, which I think are on the next slide. So please do take a look at the Charity Digital Code of Practice, completely free, or a framework to hopefully help you move forward with digital. Feel free to drop me an email if you'd like to. And then there's lots of free resources out there now to help charities with digital. Obviously, there's tons of great stuff from Charity Digital themselves. So please do look at those. And then a couple of other things that are out there: Digital Candle, which is a way to get a free hour of pro bono advice for any burning questions you might have about digital. And then also Catalyst have some great digital resources as well. So tons out there to help you hopefully take your next steps forward with digital.
Brilliant. Thanks so much, Zoe. So that's all we've got time for. For those of you who maybe want to refer back to this or couldn't catch all of the session, the recording of it will be available fully subtitled within about a week. And we'll be taking on board your comments and ideas in terms of looking at the next steps as we take forward the code as well. So thank you very much for your time, everybody, and I hope you have a good rest of the week. Bye.